Hello there and welcome to Data Science Raw TV with me, Gary Short. This is episode 1, the one about coronavirus. Since this is the first episode, we should really do some introductions. So, firstly, the Data Science Raw TV channel. Why is it called Data Science Raw TV? Well, it's raw because, to be quite honest, I don't have the time or the inclination to do any of the fancy editing. So it's going to be the raw footage, just me, my camera, and some applied data science. Secondly, who am I? My name is Gary Short. I'm a freelance data scientist, instructor, and speaker based here in Scotland. So this is episode 1, the one about coronavirus. Let's get started. So recently, and this is a function of my political interests I guess, but recently my social media has been flooded with people commenting with the following assertions. Firstly, England or the UK, and people, especially on social media, people tend to conflate these two things as if they're the same thing. But England and the UK has handled the coronavirus badly. Secondly, that Scotland has handled the coronavirus well. And thirdly, that Scotland is slow to come out of the lockdown. That's pretty much what my social media has been filled with over the past week or two. So I started to wonder, are these people right? Is there any evidence to support this? So I decided to take a look. So the first thing we're going to look at is this assertion that England or the UK has handled the coronavirus badly. First thing we're going to need to decide that question is some data, and I'm going to pick up some COVID data from ourworldindata.org. You can pick up the same data from the same place if you want to play alone at home. Once we get this data and we open it up and we have a look at the columns available, we can see that there's probably enough information there for us to answer those questions that we've got. So how up to date is this data? Well, we can see here that the data is correct as of today, which is the 20th of May 2020. When we look at how many countries are surveyed, we can see there are 212 countries in the survey, so that is quite an in-depth survey. When we look to see, of course, who's got any up-to-date, who has up-to-date information, we can see that the number of countries with up-to-date information, i.e. data from today, has dropped to 209. And this shouldn't really surprise us, really. This is a centralized data repository, which, of course, has to have a cutoff point at some point for the day's figures. And because they're surveying 212 countries from across the globe, then it's obvious that some countries are going to miss the deadline for reporting, and so they're not going to be available in today's data. So we should take a look and see which countries are missing and see if we care about any of them really for the purposes of our analysis. So when we have a look at the 3 countries that don't have data for today, we find Spain, Hong Kong, and this entity just referred to as international. Now, although we don't care too much about Hong Kong for the purposes of this analysis, we do care about Spain. Spain is a major economy in the EU. We're going to be looking at the EU, so we should try and pick up the Spanish data if we can. If we actually take a step back and look at yesterday's data, instead of today's, we can find that the number of countries with current data stands now at 210, so we've picked one up. Again, if we look at which countries are missing, we can see that we have picked up the Spanish data, so that's good and we can carry on now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a function here whereby where I give it a list of countries and a measure, then the function will return me that particular measure sorted in descending order for the list of countries that I've passed in. So 210 countries is a bit too many to work with for our analysis, so we're just going to look at the EU countries. And for the sake of just making sure that everybody can play along with the same list, I've just decided to pull a list of the EU countries from the internet, and of course you can pull the same list yourself, so we're all talking from the same page. Now that I have that list of EU countries, I can feed the list of EU countries into my function here, along with the measure that I want to look at, which is total deaths, and that gives me the plot down here. So we can see that United Kingdom, Italy, France, Spain, Belgium, Germany, all kind of at the top. And you'd expect to see this really because these are the most populous countries in the EU. And this just gives us the idea that looking at total deaths, when what we're trying to do is to establish which governments and countries have handled their COVID-19 pandemic the best, looking at the absolute number doesn't really help us very much. And the reason it doesn't help us very much is that the coronavirus, like all viruses, will have an infection rate. So we'll say, for the sake of argument, that that infection rate is 20%. What that means is if everybody in your country were to be subjected to COVID-19, then 20% of the people would get the disease. Now, if your country has a larger population in the first place, the absolute number that 20% represents is going to be bigger. So looking at the absolute number doesn't really help us much. What we want to do is we want to control for the population size. Luckily, the data set that we're looking at comes with population information. So we can kind of verify that what we think from the previous graph is actually true by having a look at the population. And we can see we're pretty much right actually. There's Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain, all at the left-hand side of the graph with high populations. Luckily, the data set that we've got allows us to control quite easily for population because it actually has a measure which is total deaths per million. So if we feed in, again, our list of EU countries, and this time we ask for the total deaths per million, what we'll get is the total deaths controlled for population size. So we can see once we've done that Belgium, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom still up there with the highest death rates in the EU. The next thing that we've got to think about here really is that a disease that's passed from person to person is obviously going to be affected by the population density. It's obviously a lot easier to catch the virus if you're in a densely populated area than if you're in a sparsely populated area. And since what we're trying to do, the questions that we're trying to answer within this analysis is which governments and which countries have handled the pandemic best, we want to remove the advantage that a country might have because it's sparsely populated. You may have a low infection rate in your country just because the population is spread out and it's very hard for the virus to get from person to person. Whereas another country with a densely populated country might have a high infection rate, although they're working really hard, it's just because it's very easy for the virus to spread from person to person. So just like we controlled for population, we also want to control for population density as well. Now to do that, what we have to do is we have to create another function which will take, again, it will take a list of countries, and again, it will take a measure. But this time it will actually divide by the unit of population density. So what we're actually going to get is a measure controlled for population density. So we measure by population density for a list of countries that we pass in. Having done that, what we're going to ask again is for our list of EU countries. Again, we're going to ask for the total deaths per million measure, but we're going to have it controlled by population density. And now we can see the left-hand side, or the worst end of the graph, looks a little bit different. So here we've got Sweden in first place, followed by Spain, Ireland, France, Finland, Italy, and the UK down there. So if that is 27, the UK is what, 27, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 20th. So the UK is in 20th out of 27th place, which is not a great position to hold. Interestingly, or at least I find it interesting, once you control for population size and density, Sweden comes out as having the highest death rate in the EU. And interestingly enough, Sweden is a country that did not go into lockdown. And this evidence suggests that they may be paying the price for that. The next thing that we're going to look at is this idea that Scotland has handled the coronavirus well. So let's take a look and see if we can find any evidence to either support or act against that assertion. So the data set that we're looking for, although it has UK numbers in it, it doesn't have the home nations of the United Kingdom split out in the world data. It just has the UK as a whole. So what we have to do is we have to create the information for the 4 home nations: England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And to get that information, I've picked up the number of deaths from the coronavirus.data.gov.uk site, and I've picked up the population size and density figures from that link there on Wikipedia. So if you want to follow along at home and pull the same data that I was using, you can get that from there. What I've done there then is I've then created a data frame of the same shape as the global data that I'm looking at, and we can have a look to see what it looks like just for the home nations. And when we plot that data, we can see that Scotland has the worst death rate in the UK when controlling for population size and density. And in fact, not only does Scotland have the worst death rate, actually it's almost, not quite, but it is almost as bad as the other 3 nations combined. So to be fair, that's a pretty appalling score. We can then, because that data frame that I've created for the UK home nations is the same shape as the global data frame that I have, we can actually add the UK home nations data into the EU data that we had, and we can see what that looks like. We can see that Sweden is still the worst, Spain is still second, but now Scotland is there in 3rd place as the 3rd highest death rate in the EU, followed by Ireland, France, Finland, Wales, Italy, Belgium, Northern Ireland, get to the United Kingdom, and then Estonia and England. So what that tells us is the United Kingdom is performing pretty badly. It was, if you recall, 20th out of 27th for the EU, but actually the home nations in the United Kingdom, apart from England, are all performing worst. England performs slightly better than the UK as a whole. Third thing that we want to look at is this assertion that Scotland is slow at coming out of lockdown, and is that justified or is it not justified? And let's see if we've got any evidence that can help us answer whether that assertion is correct or not. So to come out of lockdown, as well as a low infection rate, and we've already established that Scotland does not have a low infection rate, Scotland has the 3rd worst death rate in the EU. But along with that, what you need is a good testing regimen. So the testing figures are available for some of the countries in that data set, but the testing figures themselves don't really answer the question of how effective your testing regime is. Regimen is, sorry, not regime. So what I've done here is I've created a measure that is actually the total tests divided by the total cases. So what that figure tells us is a number which represents the number of tests you had to do before you find a positive case. And what that is indicative of is how widespread your testing is. So let's say, for the sake of argument again, that the COVID-19 virus has an infection rate of 20%. So for your entire population, 20% of your population is going to get the virus. So if you tested that entire population, if you tested your entire population, 20% would have the virus, 80% would not have the virus. So for every 10 people that you tested, 8 people would not have the virus and 2 people would have the virus. So you would have to roughly, well, in this case exactly, you would have to test 5 people before you found one with the virus. So obviously the higher that number is, that is indicative of the more of the community you're testing. And the lower that number is, if you're only testing 1 or 2 or 3 people before you find somebody with the virus, then that is indicative of the fact that you may only be testing patients in hospitals, people in care homes, or people who are already exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19. So basically, you're only testing people that you expect to have the virus. That figure gives us a kind of measure of how effective your testing regimen is. With that new measure then that we created, we can ask for the figures, we can ask our data set for the figures for the EU. Now, as you can see, not very many countries in the EU actually record their testing numbers. But for those who do, we can see here Lithuania at the left-hand side doing lots of testing or indicative of doing lots of testing in the community, down to Ireland on the right-hand side here, and Italy, which is indicative of the fact that they're probably not testing a lot of people in the community, and probably only testing hospitals, care homes, and people with symptoms. Now, because the UK's figures are missing from this list, that doesn't really help us very much, but it demonstrates the point that I'm trying to make. So, to be more helpful, what we need to do is we need to pick up the United Kingdom and Scotland's testing figures. Now, I've gotten the testing figures from Scotland from the coronavirus daily update for Scotland. Scotland does post on a daily basis its cumulative testing and cumulative cases numbers. So the cumulative number of tests being done in Scotland as of today, the 20th of May 2020, is 92,594. You can see the figure there. And for the UK, I have picked up the figures from the DHSC Twitter account that publish their figures daily as well. Now, the figures around testing are a little bit complicated, and they're complicated just because of the way the UK shares and pools the resources of the Union. So we see the figures there for the United Kingdom. Now, although that is predominantly England, the other home nations do enjoy sharing and pooling of resources. So actually the UK as a whole does actually carry out some testing for the other home nations. However, the figures don't actually break those out. So we don't have any idea from those figures how many of those figures actually belong to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, although they will predominantly be England. We have the same problem in Scotland as well. Although the Scottish Government do publish the daily figures, we know from previous statements that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has made that more than 50% of the testing carried out in Scotland is actually carried out by the UK on behalf of Scotland. So that figure of 92,594 is the total number of tests carried out in Scotland, but is not necessarily Scotland's figure. It's the total number carried out for Scotland, but some will be carried out. In fact, more than half will be carried out by the United Kingdom on our behalf, and it's a benefit that we get from pooling of sharing of resources in the UK, but doesn't really help us get down to this, get down to the nitty-gritty. So we have to make some assumptions, and because the numbers are not particularly big, I believe that it's not actually going to change the shape of the graph too much. The absolute numbers won't be 100% accurate, but the shape of any graph that we generate this will be roughly right. So we're going to make the assumption for this analysis purposes that the number posted by the Scottish Government is actually a true reflection of the testing done by Scotland. We're just going to say that all of those tests are done by Scotland. And we're going to say that the figures posted by the United Kingdom, which will predominantly be England's, but not entirely, we're just going to say that actually they are all of England's figures. So having created this data set, we can now go along and we can have a look at that. And we can feed those numbers back into the EU numbers that we had. And we can see actually that the United Kingdom as a whole doesn't perform very well, right down near the bottom. However, Scotland is worst. So Scotland is the worst of the figures that we have in the EU. Because not all countries record testing, actually there's few enough that we can actually feed those numbers into the entire data set and ask for every country of the 210 that actually has information on testing. We can ask to see that, and we can see that Scotland is right down here. So that's what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So Scotland is sixth worst, in the world. in terms of testing. And actually, the countries that we are better than, Nigeria, Iran, for example, that's, to be honest, to be blunt, that's nothing really to shout home about. Now, although Scotland is really bad, to be honest, the United Kingdom doesn't come out much better. That is not a great graph to look at in terms of testing. So what we can say from this is that really the United Kingdom's testing is bad and Scotland's is even worse. So what kind of conclusions can we make then from our analysis and trying to answer those questions? So there is evidence to support the notion that the UK, bearing in mind that gets conflated in social media with England, so there is evidence to support this notion that the UK as a whole is performing badly when compared to other EU countries. But actually, if you're conflating it with England, then England is performing slightly better than the other home nations and slightly better than the UK as a whole, but no one is setting the heather on fire, as it were. You know, the UK is not performing well. So it's a fair statement to make that the United Kingdom is not handling the COVID-19 pandemic very well. The second thing that we looked at, we can say in conclusion then that there is no evidence at all to support the notion that Scotland is performing well or better than the UK or England. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest that Scotland is the worst performing home nation and compares very poorly with other countries in the EU and across the world. So Scotland had the third highest death rate in the EU and the worst testing figures in the EU. So there's no evidence at all to support this idea that Scotland is handling the COVID-19 pandemic very well. Which begs the question, why is there this perception that Scotland is handling the COVID-19 pandemic well, or at least better than the other nations in the UK? And I believe it's just because, this is just my hypothesis, of course, but my belief is because Nicola Sturgeon can articulate a strategy very well. She speaks very well, and she can articulate a strategy very well, even if that strategy, as the evidence shows us here, isn't actually making a big difference on the ground. I guess it's just a function in the political world that we live in right now with the likes of Trump and Johnson, that anybody who can stand in front of a podium day after day and read accurately from an auto cue comes across as being a good leader. I think that's why people believe that Scotland is handling the COVID-19 pandemic well, but in fact, actually, we're not at all. And lastly, this assertion that Scotland is coming out of lockdown slowly. Well, there is evidence to suggest that the reason Scotland is coming out of lockdown more slowly than the rest of the UK is due to us having one of the highest death rates in Europe, the third highest death rate in Europe, was having one of the lowest testing rates in the EU and across the world. And to be fair, under these circumstances, it is only prudent that Scotland comes out of lockdown very slowly. And that's it for this episode. Hit like or subscribe if you want to catch more of these applied data science videos. And until the next time, goodbye.